Welcome to the British Cartographic Society's Winter Lecture. My name is Chris Tributis. I'm the Vice President of the British Cartographic Society and today's Chair. Today, we're going to be hearing about the exploration of the Northwest Passage, the fantastic stories of Dr. John Rae and Sir John Franklin. Our speakers are going to be Eugene Rae and Fiona Gould. So just a little bit about our speakers today. Eugene is the Principal Librarian of the Royal Geographical Society. He has worked at the Society for 25 years and is part of a team that looks after the 2 billion items contained in the Society's collections. He has a particular interest in the history of exploration and has lectured for the Society. Eugene holds a Master of Arts in United States Geography and Literature from the University of London. Fiona Gould of the John Rae Society has had a career in teaching and supporting students with special educational needs, gifted children, and asylum seekers. A career which led Fiona's appointment as project manager for Southwest Sussex LEA, whereby she established an outreach program support service for students with social communication difficulties. Since retiring and living in Orkney, Fiona has worked as a volunteer for Advocacy Orkney and then for the John Rae Society as membership secretary, leading historical and archival researcher, and has been developing the partnership. So without much further ado, and to get things going, I will pass us over to Eugene and he'll start our talks for this evening.
So, yes, my name's Eugene Rae, Principal Librarian at the Royal Geographical Society, and I'm going to talk to you about Sir John Franklin. Welcome, everybody, and thank you, British Cartographic Society, for inviting me to speak. Here we have an engraving made in 1824 of Captain John Franklin after a portrait by George Robert Lewis, and he appears genial and at ease in his chosen environment. The compass and sundial in his hand and the theodolite on a tripod mark him as a man of science, a capable man who could be relied upon to lead a successful Arctic expedition. In 1824, he was in between expeditions, having returned from his first overland expedition in 1822 and shortly to depart for his second overland expedition in 1825. Franklin was born in 1876 in Spilsbury, Lincolnshire, the youngest of 12 sons. He had been intended for the church, but a visit to the seaside awoke in him a lifelong interest in the sea, and he joined the Royal Navy at the age of 14, serving aboard HMS Polyphemus. He was present at the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801, and then served with his uncle, Matthew Flinders, in HMS Investigator during an exploring voyage along the coast of Australia. He subsequently served aboard HMS Bellerophon during the Battle of Trafalgar and in 1805, and was present at the Battle of New Orleans during the war between Britain and the US in 1812. His first taste of the Arctic was in 1818, when he was given command of HMS Trent, accompanying Captain David Buchan in HMS Dorothea in a voyage towards the North Pole via Svalbard. This image is from a voyage of discovery towards the North Pole performed in His Majesty's ships Dorothea and Trent by Captain F.W. Beechey. Beechey sailed with Franklin in the Trent. And it was at this point, as the picture illustrates, that they started to encounter more challenging weather and the beginning of loose floating ice. And Beechey wrote, "The mild weather, which had thus far attended the wind from the southward, gradually yielded to a cold current from the north, which cased our sails and cordage with ice, and covered our decks with snow." And this was not the first attempt to reach the pole via Svalbard, and like the earlier expedition led by Constantine Phipps, it failed due to the presence of heavy pack ice just north of the islands. The North Pole expedition of 1818 was part of a grand strategy of Arctic exploration masterminded by Sir John Barrow, Permanent Secretary to the Admiralty, who believed that the huge surplus of ships and capable officers available after the successful prosecution of the Napoleonic Wars could be put to effective use through exploration. 1818 was also the year that the sea captain and whaler, William Scoresby Jr., recently returned from an Arctic whaling voyage, reported that ice conditions were unusually favourable. While Buchan and Franklin were labouring in the ice north of Svalbard, Captain John Ross was leading the first of Barrow's Northwest Passage expeditions. Apart from an interesting encounter with the Inuit of Prince Regent Bay, an inlet on the Greenland coast of Baffin Bay, the expedition achieved very little, as it ended prematurely when Ross thought he saw a range of mountains blocking Lancaster Sound, which is the entrance to the Northwest Passage. This slide here is made by John Sackhouse and was presented to Captain Ross, this image rather, and it shows the officers, Ross and his officers, meeting the Inuit and exchanging presents with them. Very nice little drawing. For the next attempt to find the passage, Barrow decided upon a two-pronged assault. William Edward Parry, who had been second in command during Ross's expedition, was given command of a naval expedition, and John Franklin was given command of an overland expedition, which would follow the course of the Coppermine River to the sea. Parry departed Deptford on the 4th of May 1819 in command of HMS Hecla and HMS Griper, for an expedition which was to prove one of the most successful of all the Arctic expeditions. They reached Lancaster Sound in July 1819 and quickly proved Crocus Mountains to be a mirage. Hecla and Griper sailed along the southern coast of Devon Island until seeing an inlet to the south, which is Prince Regent Inlet, which they investigated until ice blocked further progress. They then sailed on west from Lancaster Sound into Barrow Strait. More islands were discovered, which Parry named Cornwallis, Bathurst, after Henry Bathurst, 3rd Earl Bathurst, President of the Board of Trade and Secretary of the State for War and the Colonies, Byam Martin, after Sir Thomas Byam Martin, Admiralty of the Fleet, and Melville Island, after Sir Robert Dundas, 2nd Viscount Melville and the 1st Lord of the Admiralty. And together, collectively today, they're known as the Parry Islands. By early September, Parry's ships were at 110 degrees west, which entitled them to a £5,000 reward, or partial discovery of a Northwest Passage. But further progress was halted by heavy pack ice in what was later to be named McClure Strait. Excuse me. Parry decided to overwinter in Winter Harbour, which is off Melville Island, and this was the first deliberate wintering in the high Arctic by a British naval expedition. Parry had planned for this possibility, not only by taking sufficient tinned food, to be supplemented by fresh caribou and muskox meat, but also insulation in the form of padded canvas roofs for the ships. And also, he thought about the morale of the crew. Theatrical and musical entertainments were performed, and a newspaper, the North Georgia Gazette, was initiated. After a brief exploration of Melville Island, Parry turned his attention to freeing his ships. Eventually breaking free of the ice in August 1820, they tried to make progress through McClure Strait, but again they were blocked by heavy ice. After naming the visible land beyond the ice, Banks Land, now Banks Island, they turned for home. Back in London, Parry was showered with honours, appropriate for a highly successful expedition. He had almost discovered the Northwest Passage and had successfully wintered in the high Arctic. So what of Sir John Franklin, or John Franklin as he was at the time? So Franklin's orders were to proceed to York Factory on the southwestern shore of Hudson's Bay, and from there travel directly north to the Arctic shore, and then return via the Coppermine River, or, second option, to head northwest to the Great Slave Lake, and from there follow the course of the Coppermine River to the Arctic shore. And Franklin opted for the second option. Franklin, Dr John Richardson, George Back and Robert Hood and the other members of the expedition departed from Gravesend on the 23rd of May 1819 on board the Hudson's Bay ship Prince of Wales. From the start, things did not go quite as they should. A brief stopover at Yarmouth turned into a minor drama, when contrary winds forced the captain to up anchor earlier than expected, leaving George Back stranded on shore. He was told to make haste to Stromness in Orkney, from where the expedition would depart for the Arctic. Franklin was not only counting upon collecting Back in Stromness, but also a number of Orkney boatmen to work the boats on the Coppermine River. Back was successfully reunited with the expedition, but only 4 boatmen signed up, and they did so reluctantly. Prince of Wales reached the Davis Strait in late July, and they arrived at York Factory at the end of August. Before they could set off, the boat promised by the Hudson's Bay Company had to be readied. This done, they began loading, but found that the boat lacked the capacity to carry all their equipment and supplies. Franklin decided to leave the bacon, spirits and ammunition behind, with the promise that it would be sent on. They departed York Factory in company with a party of Hudson's Bay agents and their boats and made their way to Cumberland House, a small fur trading station on the Saskatchewan River, where Franklin had been expecting to pick up men and supplies. But a feud between the Hudson's Bay Company and the North West Company disrupted the supply of both. So this slide shows the party camping for the night shortly after leaving Cumberland House. It looks quite idyllic, but must have been anything but, particularly with the shortage of supplies and equipment and lack of men. But undaunted, Franklin marched on with very limited supplies for 1,000 miles until reaching Fort Chipewyan on Lake Athabasca. He had gambled that supplies would be available here, but he again was disappointed. George Back was also proving to be troublesome again. At Fort Providence on the Great Slave Lake, Back and Robert Hood fell out over the affections of a young Native American woman who they called Greenstockings, and Back had to be sent on a journey back to Chipewyan to prevent the men from killing each other. It was at Providence that Franklin engaged the services of Acacho, chief of the Yellowknife people. He agreed to accompany Franklin's party to the sea and hunt for them. Here we have a portrait of Acacho and his son. These portraits are from John Franklin's account of the expedition. In June 1821, the expedition started down the Coppermine River, reaching the sea on the 20th of July. And here we have that view of the sea from the mouth of the Coppermine River, midnight, July 20th, 1821. They were the first Europeans to reach the river's mouth for 50 years. The next leg of their journey saw them survey the coast of Coronation Gulf, Bathurst Inlet, and the southern shore of the Kent Peninsula, before exhaustion forced them to call a halt. Franklin had been intending to return the same way as they had arrived, but the thought of putting out into the icy ocean again was too much, and he decided to travel down the Hood River from Bathurst Inlet and then overland to the Coppermine and back to Fort Enterprise. Acacho and his hunters had returned home by this point. Before they departed, Franklin had asked them to leave supplies at key points so that he and his men would have something to eat on the return journey. But for a number of reasons, including that Acacho did not believe Franklin and his men would live to make the return journey, he didn't leave any supplies. And by this time, they were so short of food that they were forced to eat rock lichen or lichen, or tripe de roche, as the voyageurs called it, and also the leather from their boots and jackets. At this point, things took a turn for the macabre. Back went ahead to collect supplies, and Franklin struggled after him, leaving Hood and two others behind with a hunter called Michel Teroate. After a while, Teroate caught up with them with fresh meat, which he claimed was wolf flesh. Richardson, the expedition surgeon and naturalist, believed the meat to be human flesh. A short while later, Teroate also claimed that Hood had committed suicide, but on inspecting the body, it was found that the gunshot was to the back of his head, which suggested that Teroate had murdered Hood. Richardson was convinced that Teroate intended to murder them all, so shot him dead. Acacho did eventually supply them with fresh meat, which Back was able to deliver to the survivors, who were thus spared any further horrors. And Franklin was known thereafter as the man who ate his boots. Now this map here, which is from a map made by White in 1904, shows the section of coast surveyed by Franklin's first overland expedition. And it's the gold shading, which you can see beneath Coronation Gulf, and with Bathurst Inlet and the southern shore of the Kent Peninsula. Overland expeditions were often of longer duration than maritime expeditions, and before Franklin and his surviving companions arrived back in England, Parry had begun his next expedition. On this expedition, he was directed to seek a passage to the north of Hudson's Bay in Fox Basin. He sailed in April 1821 and began by investigating Repulse Bay by way of the Frozen Strait. The idea that being that Repulse Bay might not be a bay at all, but a strait leading to another possible route for a Northwest Passage. In fact, Repulse Bay proved to be just that, a bay. And by now it was September, and after some further explorations along the north coast of Melville Peninsula, they settled in for the winter in a small cove on the south coast of the peninsula. This was to be a very interesting time for them, as the area they had chosen to winter in was one frequented by the Inuit. Parry's account of his second voyage, second voyage in command, is packed with superb engravings based upon the drawings of Captain Lyon and some very detailed charts showing the movement of the ships. During the winter, they were visited regularly by Inuit, and Parry obtained some very useful maps drawn by Iligliuk, a local woman. In July 1822, Parry resumed exploring Melville Peninsula, aided by the Inuit maps. Near the large Inuit community at Igloolik, they located and named Fury and Hecla Strait. This strait separates Baffin Island from the North American mainland and leads on to Prince Regent Inlet, which Parry had explored during his first expedition. As Fury and Hecla Strait was blocked by ice, Lyon led a sledging party across the peninsula to confirm open water on the far side. This was an exciting discovery, as it seemed to offer a more southerly and shorter entrance to the Northwest Passage than did Lancaster Sound. Parry and Lyon spent the summer practicing kayaking and learning to drive dogs. As there seemed little prospect of making progress through the ice, and another winter in the Arctic would put too great a strain on the health of his men, Parry decided to return home, arriving in October 1822 to a hero's welcome. He had been promoted to captain while away, and he was now appointed acting hydrographer to the Navy. And these are a couple of artefacts from the Society's collection, which were brought back by Parry on his second voyage in command. So we have a pair of Inuit boots, and also this eye protector, which is a sort of visor with slits to stop the glare from the snow, causing snow blindness. A couple of years later, the Admiralty decided to send him out again, and in May 1824 he left London in the Hecla, accompanied by Henry Parkins Hopner in the Fury. With them were Horatio Thomas Austin, James Clark Ross, Francis Crozier and William Hooper. The goal this time was Prince Regent Inlet, at the west end of Baffin Island, where he had been blocked by ice in 1819. It was a bad year for ice, and he did not reach Lancaster Sound until the 10th of September. They entered Prince Regent Inlet, but after 60 miles, about 97 kilometres of heavy ice, they were forced to winter at a place he called Port Bowen on the eastern shore. In late July 1825, they freed themselves from the ice, but shortly thereafter they were caught by wind and drifting ice, and Fury was driven against the western shore and damaged by the ensuing pressure of the ice. After 48 hours working the pumps, they made an attempt to deliberately beach the ships for repairs. Stores were unloaded, but by the 25th of August it was clear that Fury's keel was broken, and the advancing ice forced them to abort further efforts. Most of the stores were left on the beach, and the crew taken on board the Hecla, which reached England in October 1825. And Parry published an account of this voyage in 1826. The wreck site, known as Fury Beach, became an important landmark. Sir John Ross reached it in 1829. He found the hulk gone, but many of the stores and Fury's boats and anchors were piled on the beach. When his ship was frozen in further south, his expedition depended upon those stores before they could be rescued. Back to John Franklin. When Franklin heard that Parry was to lead another expedition, he contacted the Admiralty to propose another overland expedition to continue the coastal survey, which he had begun on the Coppermine River expedition earlier. And we have in the archives at the Society this lovely little sketch map of a proposed route of a land expedition, 1825-27. I don't know whether this is the plan or a copy of the plan which he sent to the Admiralty, or whether this one was specifically for the Society, but it reminds me of that idea of a plan written on the back of a cigarette packet. I think I'd want a bit more detail if I was going to trust him with an expedition than just this little sketch. But his plan was to travel up the Mackenzie River and then survey the coast as far west as he could, but also to survey the coast between the Coppermine and Mackenzie rivers. Aware that the Admiralty and the country would not like to see a repeat of the horrors of the previous overland expedition, Franklin reassured the authorities that similar dangers were not to be apprehended. while the objects to be attained were important at once to the naval character, scientific reputation, and commercial interests of Great Britain. He was able to persuade the Admiralty to let him supervise the construction of 3 seaworthy but lightweight boats for the expedition. Other interesting innovations included taking guns with the same bore as those used by the Native Americans in the employment of the Hudson's Bay Company, so there would be no problem about exchanging ammunition. Food supplies were also the subject of much thought, and enough was provided for 2 years in the field, so he was not going to rely on food sourced when he got there. And this food was covered with 3 layers of prepared waterproof canvas, of which material coverings for the cargo of each boat was also made. The supplies and the 3 boats were sent to Canada ahead, ensuring that no delays would be encountered when Franklin and the other expedition members arrived. It was clear that on this occasion, Franklin was leaving nothing to chance. The situation in Canada was also more conducive to success, as the Hudson's Bay Company had absorbed the North West Company, ending the dispute which had disrupted the availability of supplies on Franklin's earlier expedition. Franklin, Richardson, Back, E.N. Kendall and Thomas Drummond, plus 4 Marines, sailed from Liverpool on the American packet ship Columbia on the 16th of February 1825. Franklin's wife, Eleanor, was gravely ill, but she had encouraged him to go, knowing how much it meant to him. And before he left, she gave him a silk Union flag, which he had made for the expedition. Unfortunately, Eleanor died about a week after Franklin sailed. The expedition arrived at Cumberland House on the Saskatchewan River on the 15th of June. As with his earlier overland expedition, the distances covered were enormous. They had already travelled 2,800 miles and not even begun the descent of the Mackenzie River. By the end of the month, they had reached Fort Resolution on the Great Slave Lake, where they were reacquainted with the Yellowknives. Acacho's brother greeting them warmly. Acacho himself was out hunting game for the expedition larder. After a brief reconnaissance dash to the sea, where Franklin unfurled the flag given to him by Eleanor, the expedition settled into their winter quarters and abandoned Northwest Company Fort on Great Bear Lake. The expedition members renamed the fort Fort Franklin. It was June 2026 before the weather allowed for them to begin the next stage of the expedition. At this point, the party divided into 2, with Franklin and Back leading one group in the boats Lion and Reliance, and Richardson and Kendall leading the other group in the Dolphin and Union. The reason for the division was that Franklin was to lead one party west from the mouth of the Mackenzie to survey the coast towards the Bering Strait, and Richardson was to lead the other party east from the mouth of the Mackenzie to survey the coast as far as the mouth of the Coppermine. The Mackenzie River was braided towards its mouth, and Richardson led his group down a more easterly channel. Franklin reached the mouth of the Mackenzie River on the 7th of July and soon encountered a large party of Inuit. Franklin approached the Inuit to explain the purpose of his expedition and to offer gifts to the leaders. The Inuit received his explanation with interest and were pleased with the gifts, but as more and more Inuit approached the boat, Franklin became concerned that things would get out of hand, so started to withdraw. But Lion became stuck in the shallows and was surrounded by Inuit eager to share in the gift-giving. Back brought Reliance to Franklin's assistance, but she too was soon surrounded. The Inuit attempted to remove anything that was portable from the boats and tried to remove the gold buttons from the officers' jackets. And it was only when Back ordered his men to raise their muskets and take aim that the Inuit wisely retreated. And this is another illustration by George Back from Franklin's account of his second voyage. This one shows the Inuit approaching in numbers the 2 British boats. From then on, the Inuit ceased to cause them any difficulty, but the increasingly dense ice became a major hindrance to progress. And I think this fantastical looking image here really expresses that well. There's a real menace in these toppling bergs and floating blocks of ice. In early August, they sighted seals and whales, but Lion soon began to take on water and they needed to put ashore for repairs. With the repairs completed, they were ready to go on, but heavy fog trapped them on a small island, which they appropriately named Foggy Island. They stayed on the island for several days and then put to sea, the icy water causing the men's legs to swell. By the end of the month, they were back at the mouth of the Mackenzie. Richardson's experience had been pretty much the same as Franklin's. encounters with Inuit, some friendly, some not, and problems with heavy ice, but his party too completed their task with no loss of life. And another section from that map I mentioned earlier, this one shows the two sections of coast explored by Franklin and by Richardson. Franklin is in orange, and Richardson is in blue. And you can see there that the section that that Richardson has filled in the section between the Coppermine and the Mackenzie, and Franklin has headed east towards the Bering Sea. Franklin's second expedition was very different from his first and could be described as a complete success, in that between Franklin and Richardson, approximately 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometres of Arctic coastline was surveyed. Also, Herschel Island, Camden Bay, Prudhoe Bay, Liverpool Bay, Franklin Bay, Darnley Bay, and Dolphin and Union Strait were all explored during the expedition. The expedition is also credited with the first European sighting of Victoria Island. All this without the death and depravity of Franklin's first expedition. And if one ignores the horrors of the first expedition and concentrates on the positives, which is 500 miles or 800 kilometres of Arctic coastline surveyed, then it must be said that over the two expeditions, Franklin's achievement is impressive. On his return to England, Franklin was knighted and married Jane Griffin. With the prospect of a further expedition to complete the survey of the Arctic coastline, his happiness seemed complete. But then came an unfortunate posting as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, a post which he held until his dismissal in 1843. Although his only crime had been to show too much leniency towards the convicts imprisoned on the island, he returned in disgrace, undone by the hostility of influential vested interests. Franklin held his honour high and felt his disgrace particularly keenly. So although he was perhaps no longer up to the rigours of polar exploration, when he was offered the opportunity to lead another Arctic expedition, another naval expedition to try and find the Northwest Passage, he jumped at it, seeing in it a chance for redemption. Franklin's fateful final expedition was on the face of it well equipped for success. Franklin's age was against him, but he was a very experienced Arctic explorer, and Erebus and Terror, the ships which he was going to be taking, were proven polar vessels, and had the further advantage of new iron plating on their bows and steam-driven screw propulsion. And here we have a nice pen and ink sketch by Clements Markham, which shows the Erebus and Terror in Gravesend. And you can see the funnels of the steam coming out, which was the new addition to the ships, or one of the new additions to the ships. Several of the crew were also seasoned Arctic hands, including Franklin's second-in-command, Francis Crozier. Also, the success of the Polar Rosses and Parry's Arctic expedition tended to obscure a number of crucial weaknesses in Franklin's expedition. Namely, Franklin at 59 was too old and out of shape for the rigours of polar exploration, and he did not really have the experience of leading a large naval expedition. His previous experience as leader was of overland expeditions. He was very well liked by his fellow officers and enlisted men, but he was neither the planner nor possessed the leadership qualities of, say, William Edward Parry. And although well stocked with food, the expedition was deficient in Arctic clothing and equipment. Also not taken into account was the fact that, notwithstanding the success of the Ross's four-winter expedition, in the end they had been very lucky to survive. James Clark Ross also unwittingly was the cause of a fatal error on the part of Franklin. Had Ross not erroneously thought King William Island a peninsula, and marked it thus on his charts, Franklin could have attempted to sail east around the island rather than west into the treacherous Victoria Strait. If he had sailed east into what is now Rae and Simpson Straits, and then into Queenmore Gulf, he may even have been able to complete the transit of the Northwest Passage, as Amundsen was to do 60 years later. Clements Markham, who wrote an unpublished fictionalised account of Franklin's expedition called James Fitzjames, the story of the friendship, devoted zeal for the service, high-souled courage, self-denial, and heroic deaths of 129 British naval officers and seamen, a romance based on information and on facts so authentic and so numerous that it must be very near the truth, says this in his account. Fitzjames, who was captain of the Erebus, suggests to Franklin that they test the waters by sailing around the eastern shore of King William Island. But Franklin had what he considered an unanswerable argument against Fitzjames, and that was the chart produced by James Clark Ross. To Fitzjames' entreaties, Sir John would only answer, "My good Fitzjames, the chart is against you." Here we have the chart, which, as we see, shows King William Island as part of a larger mainland joined to the Bouvier Felix by a little isthmus. So, obviously, on this chart, there would not have been any possibility to sail round King William Island. The last European to speak to Franklin and see any of the expedition alive was a Captain Martin of the whaler Enterprise, who saw Erebus and Terror in Lancaster Sound in July 1845. From Lancaster Sound, Franklin sailed into Barrow Strait and then north into Wellington Channel, before rejoining Barrow Strait by way of Crozier Strait, and then after wintering on Beechey Island, on into Victoria Strait, where the ships became trapped. They were trapped, but that was only to be expected. Hopefully the spring would bring a sufficient thaw for the ships to break free. In the meantime, Gore led several useful sledging expeditions to the western and southern shores of King William Island, but then quite suddenly John Franklin died. As we know, no ship's logs have ever been recovered, so it isn't known how Franklin died, but barring unforeseen circumstances, it would probably have been heart failure or a stroke, although it is often suggested there is another possibility, and that is food poisoning. It is possible that the tinned food that the expedition had brought with them, and which they had no choice but to rely on, was not only contaminated with lead from the solder, but also with Clostridium botulinum bacteria, which causes botulism. Even with the intervention of modern medicine, botulism is still a very serious illness. To men weakened by the polar climate and incipient scurvy, the chances of surviving botulism were slim to none. In his book, Ice Blink, the author Scott Cookman speculates that even though food canning was not new in 1845, the safe canning of food was not fully understood. And it could have been that when the food for the expedition was canned, it may not have been heated to a high enough temperature and for a sufficient length of time to kill all of the bacteria present in the raw ingredients. And he writes, by the summer of 1847, the food cans had undergone 2 deep freezes and 3 thaws. This repeated freeze-thaw dynamic produced massive bacterial colonies and quite enough Clostridium botulinum poison to kill every man on board the expedition 1,000,000 times over. In any case, as the tinned food was all that they had to rely on, beyond biscuits and other dry goods, the fact that they abandoned it must indicate that there was something fundamentally amiss with it. So after John Franklin's death in 1847, Francis Crozier, second in command, tried to lead the men to safety by heading south round the shore of King William Island towards the Arctic coast of North America. And it's interesting to speculate that had Franklin lived longer, with his experience of 2 overland expeditions, would he have led the men south, knowing how difficult it would have been to provide for such a large body of men, rather than retracing their steps to Lancaster Sound, which it would be logical to conclude would be where any rescue missions would begin their operations. Now back to that map again, and we can see Franklin's route on here. So it's not so easy to see, but if you see where it says Peel Sound and Franklin Strait, that orangey yellow line is the route of Franklin's ships, Erebus and Terror. And you can see down the bottom where you can see Franklin dies and the ships become stuck in the ice, Victoria Strait. So I think this illustrates really the problem with King William Island and with the directions that Franklin had taken. If he'd stayed close to the coast and gone round William Island, he would certainly have had an easier time of it. Before anything was known of the fate of Franklin and his men, the Admiralty, fearing that something had gone wrong, sent out a search mission to try and find, and if possible, rescue the explorers. Franklin's old friend Sir James Clark Ross was chosen to lead this expedition, sailing from London in May 1848. The expedition consisted of HMS Enterprise, captained by Ross, and HMS Investigator, captained by Edward Byrd. Bird had been first lieutenant of HMS Erebus during Ross's Antarctic expedition. Also taking part in this expedition were Robert McClure and Leopold McClintock, who would both go on to lead their own Franklin search expeditions. Arriving in Baffin Bay in June, Ross encountered a group of whalers who informed him that it had been a particularly severe winter and there was still much ice further north. So he sailed up the coast of Greenland, avoiding the worst of the ice, and then into Lancaster Sound. The two ships sailed up and down the northern and southern coasts of the Sound, showing blue lights and firing cannons and rockets, in the vain hope of attracting the attention of Franklin's expedition, who by now were probably, if any were still alive, many miles to the south, down towards King William Island. Ross wintered on the northeastern tip of Somerset Island, putting into Port Leopold in September. And this Admiralty chart from the period shows the position of Port Leopold, which you can see on the right side of North Somerset, the eastern side of North Somerset, just below that little hook on the top, to see Port Leopold there. Winter was spent preparing for the sledging expeditions planned for the spring, and also testing out a novel method of communication. And this is the essential component of that method of communication. So what is it? This is a copper collar made to fit an Arctic fox. So these were made in the forge on board the Enterprise. And the idea is to fit these collars to captured foxes. The collar gives the location of the Enterprise, lat and longitude, and other collars on other foxes would give the location of other food depots. And the hope was that once the foxes were released, they would find their way to Franklin's camp to scavenge for food. Franklin's men would catch them, intending to eat them, and find the collars, and thus be guided to safety. The problem was, of course, that the foxes were caught way to the north, and Franklin's men by this time were too far south, so it was outside of the range of any enterprising foxes. With the spring, several preliminary sledging journeys were made to lay depots before the main journey set off in mid-May. Ross led with McClintock as his second and 12 seamen who man-hauled the sledges. They charted the north and west coasts of Somerset Island, crossed Peel Sound, which was solid with ice, and charted the east coast of the Prince of Wales Island. Because Peel Sound was solidly blocked by ice, Ross could not believe that Franklin could have sailed south, believing instead that Franklin was further west, or had gone north by way of Wellington Channel. And this misconception meant that future search expeditions also tended to dismiss the southern route. Now here's my last slide, a remarkable biscuit. So this ship's biscuit, was left at Port Leopold in 1848 by James Clark Ross, and then found by Albert Hastings Markham in 1873 and brought to the Society. With the failure of James Clark Ross to find any trace of John Franklin's expedition, in 1850 the Admiralty sent another search expedition under the command of Sir Richard Collinson and Sir Robert McClure, again making use of Investigator and Enterprise. They too failed to find any trace of the lost explorers. It seemed McClure was, in any case, more interested in completing a transit of the Northwest Passage and claiming a reward. In 1852, the Admiralty sent the last of its expeditions in search of Franklin, this one with the additional task of finding McClure. It was a large expedition with 5 ships and was under the command of Sir Edward Belcher. At the conclusion of the expedition, 4 out of the 5 ships had been lost, and the Admiralty was none the wiser as to the fate of Sir John Franklin, although McClure had been located. And as we know, it was not until 1857 that Leopold McClintock discovered the fate of Franklin, but I'll stop here in case I encroach upon the territory of my fellow speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll move on to our next speaker. So Fiona, if you're ready.
So this is where John Rae grew up. Very fine house in Orkney, built in the 1760s by the landowner of the time, who then a few years later lost interest in Orkney completely and moved to the south of Scotland. His son also was not particularly interested in staying in Orkney, so he appointed someone to manage the estate and also gave the tenancy of the house to the estate manager. And that estate manager was John Rae's father, who lived here, married, and had brought all his children up here. John Rae thought his childhood in Orkney had been wonderful, full of adventure and danger. No one worried about health and safety at that point. He was the sixth in a family of seven, teased by his older brothers and sisters, and spent a lot of his time out on his own when he could, on the moors, with the family dog, getting soaked and developing incredible stamina, which stood him in really good stead later in life. Sorry, I'm gabbling a bit because I'm conscious of time. This is the hall today. It's a ruin, uninhabited, Grade A listed. The John Rae Society is trying to save it. It's in the west mainland of Orkney. Opposite there is the island of Grahamsay, and beyond it, the hills of Hoy. This stretch of water here in the 19th century was a busy shipping lane. Ships were going to and from Stromness. The boys would see them regularly. In fact, they used to race the pilot boats, you know, with their little boats. They were privately educated. They had governesses and tutors. One tutor kept 4 pet eagles, and they were sea eagles, which are pretty big. And he expected the boys to provide food for them. So they had to go out and find rabbits and small birds. John Rae became a very proficient shot in this process. He thought that shooting waterfowl to feed these eagles was very, very good training in shooting. They had a boat, which their father gave them, an 18-foot boat, and he taught them how to rig it, insisted they maintained it, gave them one rule, which was that they must never make the sails fast, which on one occasion saved the young John Rae's life because he was caught in a sudden squall. But it gave a young John Rae a considerable experience of boats, again, something that he used later when he was in the Arctic. He went to study medicine at Edinburgh, switching to the College of Surgeons. He was less than 16 when he went to Edinburgh and 19 when he graduated. Two of his brothers had joined the Hudson's Bay Company. It was quite natural then that John Rae should sign up as ship's surgeon on the Prince of Wales, which was going off to Hudson Bay. He was expecting to return. He hadn't intended to settle in Canada, but they got stuck in the ice. The ice came early that year, and he had to winter in Hudson Bay down in St. James Bay, down the bottom here. And he was quite happy there. He had a birch bark canoed around the island. He cured the crew of scurvy by finding cranberries under the snow. And when he was offered a job as surgeon and clerk at Moose Factory, he signed up quite readily and in fact stayed there 10 years. His duties were not onerous, and he spent time learning different methods of hunting and fishing, and he learnt to snowshoe and how to haul sledges, and spent quite a lot of time camping outdoors in all weathers. He was incredibly hardy. So much so that he attracted the attention of George Simpson, who was the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, and who was looking for someone to carry on some surveying started by Simpson's cousin, Thomas Simpson, and Peter Warren Dease a few years earlier. And so George Simpson wrote to Rae saying, "This is what I need. I need somebody with these qualities here." And the only one that Rae didn't fit was the ability to do surveying. But Simpson said, "Well, that's all right. We will get you some tuition in surveying." And so Rae went off to Winnipeg to learn astronomy. And unfortunately, his tutor there then died. So he headed east on snowshoes and received the instruction that he needed at Toronto. He then worked with Simpson to plan this expedition, building a couple of boats in which Rae had considerable input because he did understand boats, and he chose his second in command and the men. It was a small group, you can see, of about 10 people. And he then went to Fort York on the edge of Hudson Bay, as Eugene mentioned. Spent the winter there studying, practicing his surveying and studying science before setting off in May. What he was asked to do was to survey the coast from west of Boothia to Fury and Hecla Strait, which had been something proposed by Thompson and Dease earlier. This is a map that the National Museum of Scotland produced in a book they published for Rae's centenary in 1993. Very useful map because it shows all his journeys. And in this case, up here, you can see my cursor, Rae went to winter in Repulse Bay, and he learnt from the Inuit that there was an isthmus that he could cross. He crossed that. The weather was awful, so he then went back and decided to get in supplies for the winter. So, sorry, I want to go back. Can I? Oops, sorry. Which he did by collecting fuel and stocking up a larder by shooting deer and making supplies that way. He built a stone house, but then noticed that the Inuit snow houses were actually much warmer, so he learnt how to build a snow house, and he and his men regularly built snow houses as shelters on their journeys. Anyway, at this time, he travelled up this sort of west bit of the Gulf of Boothia, and he went up on the western side of Melville Peninsula. The place he'd been asked to start from was about here, because Thompson and Dease had thought that Boothia was an island and they would be able to go straight across and then up. The plan was to get to Fury and Hecla Strait up here, which, as we know, was a way into the Arctic. So the main thing about this was that Rae introduced a new style of Arctic exploration, which was being how to be self-sufficient, to find your own food as you went along, which is something, because he was such a good shot, and Richardson, whom he later worked with, was very complimentary about Rae's shooting skills. He was able to keep people supplied with the food they needed. And when he'd completed this, he became recognized as a proficient Arctic explorer. He went to London, the first time he'd been back to Britain in 14 years, and was then recruited by John Richardson to join in the search for Franklin. And John Richardson had thought that Franklin might aim for the area that they had explored earlier, between the Mackenzie River and Coppermine. And so his plan was to search from the Mackenzie River to the Coppermine, go along the south of Victoria Island and so on, but ice prevented them. I'm now going to sort of go back quickly to the map, so I can just show you on the map that they started here, went up the Mackenzie River and along here to the Coppermine. They couldn't get any further because the weather was not good. Rae then wintered at Fort Confidence here, and Richardson actually went back to England. Rae tried to repeat this the next year, but the weather was just as bad, and it was a very unsuccessful expedition. And the tragedy was that he lost the only man he ever lost on an expedition, an Inuit called Albert One Eye, who drowned at Bloody Falls trying to save a boat that had gone adrift. And Rae was very upset about that. Because he said he was a very fine young man. The Hudson Bay, at this point, wanted him to take up his responsibilities with them and put him in charge of Mackenzie District, which was quite a promotion. Down here, there's a picture of an inflatable boat designed by Halkett, which Simpson presented Rae with one of these, and Rae did find it useful. At one occasion, he used tin plates as paddles, and this is from Stromness Museum. It's a model, but the original Halkett boat that Rae had is also in the museum. So 1850, England was desperate for news of Franklin. I've got a family diary with entries for 1850, and in the middle of it, it says, "There's still no news of Sir John Franklin." All of London was talking about it. Rae was asked to do it and sort of told that, you know, he was an ideal chap for the job, and he could choose, he could complete free choice as to sort of how he conducted the search. So he designed and rigged 2 small boats and planned 2 expeditions in one season. And I'm just going to go back to that map. And what he did was he went early in the season when the ice was hard, on foot across and then up round Wollaston I'm having problems here with the exploring this part, and then came back, and with the boats he went along this strait and through here and round to this point here, and interestingly, on the way he found 2 pieces of wood which came from a ship, and they presumably came from Terra and Erebus, but at the time Rae didn't associate them with that. This is a sketch. It's like the one that Eugene just showed you. This is just showing the route of the Franklin expedition. Very simply, they came in and the ships were abandoned about here, and that blue dot, if you can see it on there, that's the point that Rae reached in 51 or so, and he had hoped to get across to King William Island, but the ice was too much. It was only about 40 miles, but he decided he couldn't do it. But I mean, had he been able to get across, he would undoubtedly, he wouldn't have been able to save anyone. It was too late because they'd abandoned in 48. But he would have been able to find more evidence of what had happened. So this was quite a good period in Rae's life. He'd been offered, you know, promotion, I mean, considerable responsibility in the HBC. He'd had something published. He'd been given the Royal Geographical Society's gold medal, and he'd been given an honorary MD by McGill University, of which he was obviously very proud, because this portrait that's in the National Galleries of Scotland, he commissioned that. He was clearly proud of that honorary thing. But then on his 4th journey, he discovered the fate of the Franklin expedition. I was going to go back to the map, but well, perhaps I will very quickly. In orange, Rae had asked if he could do this because he wanted to complete the original survey that he'd been asked to do. So he went back to Repulse Bay, and this time he went across Boothia to the part that Thompson and Dease had got to near the Castor and Bollocks River. Sorry, anyway, I'll just go back now. And on this journey, he met Inuit who had heard from other Inuit about the lost survivors of the Franklin expedition. Rae went back to Repulse Bay, interviewed more Inuit, invited people to sort of bring him evidence, and he was given relics that clearly had belonged to crew members, decided he must go back to London with this information. He did. It was not well received. I'm sure people are aware of this, that people were reluctant to believe testimony of native people. Charles Dickens did a piece about how untrustworthy the Inuit were, and you know that they were violent and irresponsible, could not be relied on. Nobody in London was happy about the suggestion there'd been cannibalism. for people who'd been to Canada, as we heard earlier, cannibalism was not unknown, but in London it was unthought of. People wrote to the Times saying, why didn't Rae do this and that, showing that they didn't really understand the geography and the conditions there. And the relatives of the crew, particularly Lady Franklin, they didn't want to accept it. They didn't want to give up. They wanted more information. It's disappointing that people like Richardson and Ross and McClintock, who believed Rae's account and said so, but not publicly, they didn't support him. The Admiralty had offered a reward for the information, but they withheld that until 56. And one of the points that really annoys people in the John Rae Society is that of all the people who were involved in the search for Franklin, Rae was the only one who didn't get a knighthood, and probably did as much to search as anyone. But anyway, following that, Rae, he did have the reward money. His plan was to have a boat built to his specifications and to take it up and to sail it through the strait now called Rae Strait, just to see if that was the link in the Northwest Passage. He was too late to go to 57 and lent the boat to his brothers who had a shipping business, and the boat was sunk in a storm in Lake Ontario. It's still at the bottom of Lake Ontario. And that was the end of his dream. He'd left the HBC. He gave up Arctic exploration. He married in 1860 and later in the 60s decided to settle in Britain, though he was the only one of his family who did. And he spent his time as a member of various scientific institutions. He wrote papers, he gave lectures, he was given awards, which he treasured, and he became involved in arguments with the Admiralty about the fact that they didn't recognise the surveying that had been done by Simpson Dease and himself, and that went on for quite a long time. Before I tell you about this map, I'll tell you about another map, which is the one that got away. A map came up, we were told there was one coming up for auction in April 24, and it was an Admiralty chart of 55, and it credited one of the Navy, Collinson, with charting areas that Simpson and Dease and Rae had done, and Rae objected, and that he'd written on that particular chart, which had been given to someone, we're not quite sure who. Anyway, it was auctioned. The John Rae Society raised a considerable amount of money to buy it, but it went to a private buyer who is not prepared to sort of share it in any way. However, the resulting conversations about it and correspondence revealed that there was a map in Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, given by Rae to an American, a Captain Rae, and similarly written on. It's a circumpolar map, and you can't see it, I'm afraid, on this one, but it has got the names of all the Arctic explorers, starting with Cabot. And then you can see at the sides here and so on that it's got bits of writing by Rae. And I'll just mention these to you, that he's complaining in this one that somebody else was credited with areas that he thought Dease and Simpson had mapped, and he obviously was proud of his letters because he's put them all down the bottom here. There's one bit that I can't quite make out down here, so if anybody has any thoughts on that, after there's a little bit that's not quite clear to me. And then he was also annoyed at this point. By this time, he was in his 70s and perhaps entitled to get a bit crotchety. A chap called Frederick Schwatka had gone to Nunavut on a quest to try and retrieve papers relating to the Franklin voyage. And he had made a claim that he'd made the longest sledge journey in history. And Rae objected to that because he said their situations were not comparable. He was pointing out that Schwatka had ships nearby with supplies, whereas he had to provide his own supplies or go 1,000 miles to get them. He couldn't resist putting in bits that he considered he had personally traced and mapped and so on. And he marked other bits, and he put in his 2 telegraph surveys that he'd done. And then he's carrying on the same theme here, saying that Schwatka's evidence was very sketchy, that he was misquoting. He was talking about Rae having been to places he hadn't been, and saying, I think with good reason, that their situations were not comparable, that Schwatka had considerable support, whereas Rae hadn't. And finally, he's pointing out that he's listing that he made these long sledge journeys without dogs, or with, in one case, 2 half-starved dogs. And he then comments that it wasn't always easy to get hold of dogs. And he makes this interesting remark that if he'd been able to get dogs in 53, then again, it would have been a different story. He would have been able to have examined the whole of King William, and he would have been able to find out much more about what had happened to the Franklin expedition. So finally, because I'm afraid I'd rather rush through this because of time, what did he say about himself? In 56, he gave an account of all the travelling he'd done, which was over 6,000 miles on foot, on snowshoes, that would be. He was a very prodigious walker on snowshoes. He walked miles on them. As I said, his stamina was quite extraordinary. He also travelled in small boats, and he claimed this territory that he had surveyed. He was proud of these. He was very exact about it. Stephenson, one of the later explorers, described Rae as a man exact and truthful, and I think that was very true of him. But at the same time, he was quite modest about his journeys in the Arctic, saying, well, that's just what Hudson Bay people did. They did it as if it was just anybody's journey. And if anything, he underestimated his own stamina. He thought everybody could sort of, walk miles and miles. He was still able to walk 30 miles in his 70s, he was very, very tough. Okay. So I'm afraid I've rattled through that rather because of time, but that's it.
Thank you very much. That's been a very, very interesting talk there again. It's so thank you very much to both speakers. It was genuinely a pleasure hearing both of those sides. And so now we'd just like to open up to any questions from the audience. I can already see that we've got some links have been put into the chat of some of the maps from the National Library of Scotland and the John Rae and the John Rae Society. But if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll come to them. No, it's been fascinating hearing from both of you. Both of you have interesting, very interesting stories from both sides, and it's very interesting. It's genuinely interesting hearing just from the characters that went through these fairly extreme environments and the amount of work that they did. Yes, okay. So here we have the first question in. Right. Can you say a bit about the current status of Rae and the rehabilitation and the relationships with Franklin? So, speakers?
Well, we have been in touch with members of the Franklin family. As people know, we had a descendant of Franklin's brother giving a talk about Franklin and Rae quite recently. There is no sort of animosity between the families, certainly. I hadn't known so much about Franklin when I started out. I have warmed to him as time went on. You know, I think, as Eugene said, he was an honest man. He was respected. It's a shame that he took the evidence of James Clark Ross for granted, whereas Rae was much more questioning. He didn't take things for granted so much. I mean, people believing that Boothia was an island, he didn't think it was, and he sort of backed his own hunches. So they were different in that way. I don't know about rehabilitation. As I said, there's no animosity between the families. The people that Rae was probably and Rae, liked what he knew of Franklin. The people he got really cross with were the Admiralty, because they did treat him as a kind of inferior specimen. I mean, he was referred to as a fur trader, and he felt that the Admiralty regarded the Hudson Bay people as inferior species. Eugene, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, just to echo that, really. I think that both people really, I'm not going to say fell foul of the Admiralty, but I think for John Franklin, as you say, John Franklin possibly lacked imagination, but he was also sort of part of an institution which was very regulation bound, hide bound, only believed in doing things its own way. I mean, Rae was successful because he lived with the Inuit. He knew how to really work in the cold environment. He knew how to travel. He'd spent a lot of time, he knew how to hunt. He was an expert in all those things himself. Whereas Franklin, they came along and they would rely on other people to hunt their food for them, for instance. I know Richardson was a good shot himself, but they very much believed in sort of delegation and leaving things to other people, which they thought wasn't part of their job. And also the simple fact of sending two large ships, 129 men, into a part of the world where food is very scarce and resources are very scarce, insisting on sticking to all of the rules and regulations, man-hauling sledges, all the other things they did, it really put them at a disadvantage. So people like Franklin was already at a disadvantage, I think, because of the rigidity of the Admiralty, which I think is also what you touched upon there. Whereas Rae didn't have those kind of, restrictions placed on him. If he was good at something, they would say to him, go and do it.
And Rae was much more sort of egalitarian. I mean, he mixed well. I mean, when he was at Moose Factory, he made friends with one of the local people and went out and about. And he hadn't any sense of class. I think one of the reasons why Victorian society didn't much take to him was that that he was too happy to rub shoulders with everyone, and they did accuse him more or less of going native.
That was also the worst thing, wasn't it? They always held that as the worst thing that they could do. But in actual fact, if they wanted to survive, that was the thing to do.
Yeah, but he didn't go down well in Victorian society. I remember Lady Franklin thought he was looking a bit shaggy when he went to see her. She disapproved.
Yes, whereas John Franklin always looked very shiny.
I've just noticed here in the chat that Bob has said that a few places, there are more places named after Rae than you might think. There's Rae River, which they named, and there are various sort of bits and pieces called Rae. I know a geologist found several Rae themed places to tell me about, but that's just.
Well, got another interesting question here. Is the how much duplication was there of the land journeys of Franklin and Rae?
There's definitely some duplication, and Franklin was also covering ground which had been covered before in some cases as well. So there was duplication there as well, and a lot of overlap, I think, as well. So, yeah, I would say there was duplication. Not so necessarily with Rae and Franklin, but with Franklin and other people, and um, possibly with Rae and some other characters as well. I think McClure and Rae covered some of the same ground. Um, yeah, I couldn't, without seeing the maps, it's hard to be precise about it, but I think there was.
Well, you and I had a discussion about, a sort of common contribution of these various explorers to
Yes.
the concept of the Northwest Passage, didn't we?
Yeah. Yeah. It was
And
very much
there was a lot of luck in it, wasn't there? Because, Parry was lucky I know he got a long way, but he was quite lucky with the weather. And then
yes.
there were other times when, like with Erebus and Terror, when they were extremely unlucky with the weather.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think because we're used to the concept of climate change and those kind of things that go along with that, it's hard to believe that. But I did read that when Parry went and almost got through, that was the start of a period where the climate in the Arctic got steadily worse and the ice got heavier and heavier through the rest of the 19th century, which seems remarkable when we think about what's happening today. But yeah, so all the expeditions that came later were always going to find the ice conditions getting steadily worse.
Yeah, and I think even now, I mean, it's so uncertain that any theory of a sort of Northwest Passage that can regularly be used is dodgy, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the idea of sailing round King William Island, hugging the coast like Amundsen, it seems that would be very time consuming when you see Lancaster Sound and you see that great wide stretch of water right the way across, and you think that's where you have to go. And if you can't go through there, it's not really going to be a viable sea route.
I'm looking at some of these questions. Can you see them, Eugene?
Yeah. So we've got one question here, which is just north of or the north arm of of Great Slave Lake is the community of Rae. Further north towards Great Bear Lake is Rae Lakes, community of Gambeti. The map provided in this talk shows Hudson Bay and Mackenzie River travels.
Yeah.
When did Rae travel to the community of Rae and to Gambeti on the Rae Lakes? Community members there remember Rae fondly.
Yeah, I think the short answer is I don't know exactly without looking it up. I do know I've been in correspondence with Stuart about other things. I know he's interested in this because what he's told me is that there is still folk memory of Rae in that area amongst the people there. We've discussed that. I can't answer that now because I don't have that knowledge.
No, that's still, but it's still rather interesting that you mentioned that there is still folk memory of.
Well, yes, I was very interested when Stuart told me that. In another correspondence,
Yes. So okay. So let's quickly go through a few more. So, mention was alluded to of cannibalism encountered by Franklin in early days or in the early journeys. What was the effect of that in London?
I don't suppose they told them.
Yeah.
I mean, because I read recently that there was a case that Simpson knew about, and he was surprisingly sympathetic to the act of cannibalism and just said, well, they were starving. I'm not surprised. But obviously, Londoners didn't think that. And somebody recently wrote a piece for me about how if it had been Scandinavia, nobody would have raised an eyebrow about the cannibalism. It was just London, I think London society was probably all sort of wrapped up in turning the world pink, wasn't it, at the time?
Yeah. Right. So just interesting comment here. It's the interesting times when the men involved named the places they explored after themselves, or where they came from. I'm sure
their wives
had their own names for places.
Well, most of them have been renamed with Inuit names, haven't or a lot of A
Yeah.
lot of them have been now.
But they also named them after the powerful people that employed them, like the people at the Admiralty. A lot of places got named after the Lords of the Admiralty. Of course, Franklin named places after both his wives, Jane and Eleanor.
Other countries involved?
Yes. Were there any other countries involved in explorations of these areas at these times?
There were quite a few. Well, there were American expeditions involved in the search for Franklin because Lady Franklin went down well in America, and there were a few expeditions that set out the Grinnell expedition, I think, and there was one or two others, the American expeditions that went to look for him. But whether they'd actually the actual sort of search for the Northwest Passage, it seems from 1818 right up until, I don't know, 1850 something, seemed to have been largely a British enterprise, I would say. Which is not to say there weren't other nationals involved, but I think the Admiralty, because John Barrow and the Admiralty being the prime movers, most of the big expeditions, at least, certainly were British expeditions.
Well, didn't you say that it was to give the Navy something to do after the end of the Napoleonic Wars?
Yes, exactly. Maybe other countries didn't have such big navies that needed something to do, or the Americans became more involved with the search for the North Pole, or to try and reach the North Pole, of course. So that sort of occupied them. And then, of course, there were other Nansen and such trying to get to the north, Duke of the Abruzzi, various other European nationalities as well. But this particular Northwest Passage seems to have been mainly a British preserve, I think.
Yeah, there was honour and glory they were after, weren't they?
Right, and just a follow up to the one on naming places. It's Rae must have had a great deal of information from the Inuit. I wonder if there were any maps made that helps show this indigenous knowledge of local geography.
Well, I don't know.
We have one. There are maps which were made by Inuit, which we've got a couple of examples in our collection. But we also had recently a PhD student who worked with us, Peter Martin, and his thesis was on the subject of the amount of Inuit knowledge which was utilised by the British explorers and perhaps not necessarily acknowledged. So there was, it seems, quite a bit. As I say, but it wasn't always acknowledged as such. But I say we do have one or two maps in the Society's collection which were drawn or copied from maps drawn by the Inuit. And some of the explorers, like Parry, do acknowledge the help, the assistance of the Inuit in terms of map drawing. Yeah. Interesting that I mentioned the map that person that helped Parry was a woman as well, so it wasn't restricted to the male Inuit. The other people also had that knowledge.
Okay. Yes. Just one more question just one more one that's come in. On a recent holiday to Shetland, we read that Lady Franklin hired a boatman to Earth to row her out to outshack
Stuck at Muckle Flugger. Yeah.
So she could touch what she believed was the last piece of Britain that John Franklin would have seen.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, well, anyway, I have to say, it's been a real pleasure having you both speak to us today. It's been genuinely interesting hearing about both Franklin and Rae. It's always interesting hearing these stories and hearing the crossover that came between them when how their stories crossed over, and points. So yes, it's been. I have to say thank you very much to Eugene and Fiona for your talks. It's been a real pleasure having you on, and thank you for everyone for joining us and taking part in the talk. So I just want to say from myself and the society, and I suspect both our speakers want to say thank you as well. But I'll say from me and the society, thank you and goodbye, and leave it to both our speakers.
Yes, thank you very much for having us. It was very
No, thank you for
enjoyable.
inviting us. Yeah.
Mm.